Hi, welcome to Neuroverse
A podcast hosted by Clara.
and Carolina, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond.
Today's episode is on entropy and the entropic brain, which, yeah, it's a pretty cool sounding topic.
Yes, it sounds very physicsy.
So I'm going to start by with some definitions, but interesting definitions. So entropy, first of all, is a concept I'm sure most people are very familiar with, but it can be defined basically as a dimensionless quantity used to measure the level of uncertainty about the state of a system. So basically, how uncertain you are that a system is going to be in a specific state,
Oh, okay.
which is chaos and randomness as well. And entropy is a very physics-based concept. For example, like the second law of thermodynamics states that a system tends to have an increase in entropy. Yeah. And biological systems, however, are the opposite because to function, biological systems tend to maintain their states in the face of a constantly changing environment.
Oh, yes.
And in the context of the brain is especially complex because it receives external signals, like sensory signals, for example, as well as interoceptive signals
Oh, yeah.
based on the existing state.
That's so interesting. I'm used to thinking of like entropy and chaos within biological systems outside of the brain, but now that the brain comes into play, I hadn't taken into the fact of external signals as well as internal.
Exactly. So it obviously amplifies the level of complexity, as is common in the brain.
Yes.
And yeah, so the interesting thing about biological systems and entropy is that this means that in order for a system to function, it needs to lower its entropy. It needs to minimize the amount of uncertainty, chaos, surprise. And this is technically then against the second law of thermodynamics, which relates to a concept that I am obsessed with, which is the fact that the purpose of biology, in my opinion, is to overcome the rigidity of physics and maths, which are based on laws, but then biology comes along and manipulates these laws to create variation and diversity.
Yes.
And that's why I love biology.
I think our running theme is variation and diversity.
Yeah, for sure. Because we're biologists.
Yes.
At least I would consider myself a biologist. So I then came across the concept of the entropic brain in a paper written by David Nutt and colleagues. Lead author was Robin Carhart-Harris, and they're researchers at Imperial College London. And this paper was published in 2014. And the purpose of the paper mainly was to promote the use of studying psychedelic states to understand the brain as a system, as a biological system.
Interesting.
And so they explored the idea that the quality of a conscious state depends on the system. In this case, the brain is the system.
Yeah.
It depends on the system's entropy and randomness.
Okay.
And they explored the idea of criticality, which is the property of being at a critical point, which is in a transition of order and disorder. And they explored this in the context of psychedelics. So they said that a psychedelic state is actually a critical state, and they defined it as a primitive or primary state.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
So in a psychedelic state, the brain is in a primitive state.
Yes.
Okay.
So they defined it as a primitive or primary state, which is comparable to a brain state, a system state that our ancestors experienced, as well as infants.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But perhaps I should explain this a bit better. So they came to this conclusion, or they created this hypothesis based on neuroimaging data mainly.
Yeah.
And so they studied the level of connectivity between different parts of the brain during normal awake consciousness and during REM sleep and during psychedelic states. So patients who were given psilocybin.
So would these all be primitive states?
So they determined that during a psychedelic state and also during REM sleep, the level of connectivity is more disorganized, essentially. So there's more uncertainty in which networks will be connected with each other.
Okay.
Compared to normal awake consciousness.
So more entropy.
Yes.
In the sleep, psychedelic, and
infancy, I suppose.
Okay.
Which are, so I'll refer to as primary states.
Okay.
And so using this neuroimaging data, they observed this, and that's when they realized, paradoxically, there's more entropy in these states than there is in normal awake consciousness of a modern human.
Okay.
And that's when they defined primary states as being at a level of criticality and normal awake consciousness as being subcritical.
Okay.
And this fits with what I was describing earlier of biological systems having to maintain stability and therefore having to lower entropy.
Okay. So how come, do they explore why in these primitive states it's more entropic? Is there more uncertainty with the neural?
As in, wait, why?
Yeah, why it's more disordered?
So they simply are looking at the level of connectivity during these states.
Okay.
The reason why isn't clear, because I suppose for different states it could be different causes.
Okay.
You know?
Yeah. And so, sorry, just to reiterate, there's
fine.
a higher connectivity or lower connectivity in these primitive states?
So in, let's call them primary states.
Yes.
So in primary states, there's more entropy, more disorder, more uncertainty.
More uncertainty.
Yeah.
Okay.
And also, they then extended their entropic brain hypothesis to include more different types of states. So high entropy can also include other conscious states, such as beyond psychedelics, infant consciousness, and REM sleep. There's also early psychosis, sensory deprivation, which is interesting because that is when your brain homeostatically overcomes the fact that it's being deprived from sensory stimulation, that it creates its own.
Oh, okay.
And then near-death experiences, which is also another state where people believe that the brain sort of creates its own consciousness again.
Yeah.
And just in general, creative thinking is considered a more primary state. Whereas on the opposite end of the spectrum, so in the sort of middle of the spectrum is normal awake consciousness.
Yeah.
In the opposite end, where there's low entropy, low disorder, and it's the most rigid of states, is deep sleep.
Okay. Oh.
As well as, which we aren't we're basically unconscious.
Yeah.
OCD and addiction, where it's very rigid, and a rigid and narrow way of thinking, as well as depression, and also coma and sedation and these sorts of things. So the entropic brain theory is also related to two other key concepts. One is Carl Friston's free energy principle, which essentially dictates a similar thing. So free energy is related to entropy because it's the measure that determines the upper limit of entropy in a system. And Carl Friston's free energy principle states that the optimization of the brain is enabled by the minimization of free energy. So it's essentially the same, minimization of entropy.
Okay.
And then the second concept it's related to is the Bayesian brain hypothesis, which is related to Bayes' statistical laws, which I'm honestly not that familiar with. But this states that the brain uses an internal probabilistic model to update beliefs about sensory information, which is mathematically equivalent to predictive coding, which we talked about in a previous episode. And Carolina's face right now is just lit up because she loves predictive coding.
Yeah.
And so, according to this, the Bayesian brain hypothesis, an agent or a human must occupy a limited number of states in order to resist the natural tendency towards disorder.
Okay.
And therefore minimize surprise associated with sensory exchange with the world, which is just another way to define predictive coding.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, so we link this to the entropic state of the brain. A a brain system that has more disorder and entropy, such as a psychedelic state, would enable you to, as we've discussed in a previous episode, sort of interpret the world in multiple different ways, like interpret what the information we're receiving, both exteroceptively and interoceptively, in multiple different ways. So it's less rigid than an awake conscious state.
Okay, yeah. So in a psychedelic state, it's more primary, and
so more entropy, more disorder.
entropy, more disorder, and less predictive coding.
Yeah, so this would suggest that there's less predictive coding, because in order to predictively code, I wonder what the verb is for predictive coding, but yeah, the brain needs to use its internal models to update its prediction of external signals. Yeah. And so if there's more entropy, this is more difficult because there's more uncertainty in whether your prediction will match your internal representation. And the point of predictive coding is to limit the mismatch between internal and external. Yeah, that was so insane.
Yes.
We limited the mismatch between our depictions of
predictive coding.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned how deep sleep and addiction and depression is with less uncertainty and it's more rigid. So that's less entropy.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so essentially the easiest way to say it is you're less open-minded and
I guess more fixed. The neural pathways are probably more fixed.
And your beliefs are more fixed, which makes sense. In terms of depression, for example, your beliefs about yourself, which can be negative thoughts, are therefore like self-perpetuating.
Yeah. And the same thing with addiction. You know, you're stuck in a loop.
Exactly.
Interesting. I wonder, like, the role of entropy in leading to things such as deep sleep versus REM sleep. And I understand on a conceptual level how with creativity there's more entropy, but on a literal level, I think I mentioned this before. Is it like brain oscillations? Is it molecular activity? Is it just oxygen?
Yeah, so the main way they used to measure this, so they used studies of brain activity to formulate this hypothesis in the first place.
Yeah.
And that was mainly through neuroimaging. And by doing functional MRI, you can measure something called resting state functional connectivity to determine how connected different brain regions are functionally. So like how correlated their activity is during a resting state. And so this gives you a measure of, like, throughout the whole brain, how connected different regions are.
Okay, yeah.
And so that's how you can measure the so-called level of entropy, by seeing like
the
how
activity.
the activity between different brain regions and how much this changes. Like how stable it is. Essentially.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
It's really interesting because REM sleep is on one side of the spectrum, high entropy, and deep sleep is on the opposite side of the spectrum.
I was thinking that,
Yeah. It's almost like we cycle. So in yoga philosophy, which I'm quite interested in, they categorize different states of consciousness as awake conscious state, dream sleep state, which is equivalent scientifically to REM sleep, deep sleep, and then there's a fourth state, which is unconscious deep sleep. Like it's beneath deep sleep.
Okay.
I kind of wish I had the technical terms here. But so it made me wonder, if REM sleep is on one side of the spectrum, deep sleep is on the other side, awake consciousness is in the middle. Where in this is that kind of hidden unconscious sleep state that they talk about in yoga philosophy, which is kind of what you want to unlock.
Oh, okay.
You know? Yeah.
I wonder if it would be more entropic or less.
Exactly.
Yeah. Talking about the different states, I find it interesting how in REM sleep there's more entropy than in awake state. You know, instinctively you'd think, oh, awake means more more thoughts, more activity.
Yeah, that's why it makes sense to me, because the general idea is that in any primary state, which is highly entropic, your experience is stranger, let's just say. So like high levels of creativity, REM sleep, aka dreaming, your conscious state has a high level of possibilities. Like anything can happen, you know, like when you're dreaming, the craziest things can happen. Yeah. And another thing that is a key characteristic is there's sort of ego dissolution or disintegration for these primary states that have high entropy. And this actually fits the idea of like Freudian meta psychology, which stated that the ego is not like a thing, it's a system, a mechanistic system that works in competition with the mind to determine your state of consciousness. That's how Freud defined it. And so this fits really well, because then when you have a high level of entropy in the system, the ego, it has less of a say in a way to determine your state of consciousness. And so that's why you experience this ego disintegration.
Interesting.
And another really interesting thing I came across, of course, because it has to do with evolution and links to our previous episode on evolution, is that in the same Entropic Brain paper, they discussed how the brain may have actually evolved a capacity for the suppression of entropy over time. And this links really well to an idea we were discussing, which is Paul Chizik's idea of the evolution that has created the human brain may have essentially given us more control over our environment by altering our perception of it. And so this is all very like theoretical. But by evolving a capacity for entropy suppression, we're sort of limiting our perception of the world, making it a bit more rigid. And this made me question, is the evolution of consciousness sort of like the process of waking up? Because we're going into that awake conscious state, right? But then away from that dreaming state.
But then it falls back down into deep
sleep. So maybe in the future, far, far, far future, we'll all just be in deep sleep.
Maybe that's the true level of consciousness.
Or perhaps like it will fluctuate, and as systems do, it will find a level of homeostasis. Because it's really interesting that like over time, entropy has been suppressed.
It is interesting, and I think it plays a little bit into what you said in the evolution episode about the dynamics of like almost quote unquote our mental control and evolution, and how it's like this dynamic. It's interesting. Because you wouldn't think that we'd play a role in our own evolution, but perhaps we do.
And also that just linked me back to the enzyme-directed evolution topic. Because we're not only playing a role in our evolution, we're playing a role in the evolution of organisms just in general that exist on Earth.
Exactly. I had one more question, which is so in the paper I noticed that they say that entropy is a powerful explanatory tool for cognitive neuroscience, since it provides a quantitative index of something like randomness and disorder. I was wondering if you think that maybe entropy could be a way to quantitatively measure other topics such as subjectivity or predictive coding, things that are known to be difficult to carry out experiments on and to quantitatively measure, since they're so abstract in a way.
That's a really good point. The first thing I thought about was using it to diagnose depression, because resting state functional MRI is actually already used to, I'm not sure diagnose, but definitely study depression, especially in terms of a known network called the default mode network, which is responsible for our thoughts. Sorry, that's so vague. The thoughts that we think throughout the day, like when we're daydreaming, it's just always
in the background.
Always in the background. And the state of that network can be used to study depression. I guess it's really difficult to measure like what exactly do you mean by measuring subjectivity?
Well, when I was talking about subjectivity it was a little bit related to predictive coding, but I guess a measure of our own personal, individual, internal experiences, you know, the degree to which our
I
personal
understand what you mean,
experiences
actually.
are subjective versus the actual, like,
Reality.
yeah,
Yeah.
and
Which
external
is
inputs.
which is defined by how much predictive coding we do.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't see why not this could actually be used,
Yeah.
to be honest. I think it's not well understood. It's still very much a hypothesis.
Yeah.
But that's a really good point. And also the fact that these different states, the contrast between these states can be used to study predictive coding. Because as we were saying in that episode, like the best way to study it is to study when it goes wrong, or not necessarily wrong, but
like
different, when it changes.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I think I want to end by just posing a question to the audience, which is whether or not you believe that the evolution of consciousness has improved our perception of reality, or whether it's limited us.
I think that's a very good question. Thank you for listening to this episode.
Yeah, thank you so much for listening, and we hope you enjoyed